challenges facing aviation workers and travel agents. The purpose of our second session is to examine the challenges currently facing aviation workers and travel agents. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome Mr. Paul Hackett, a board member, Irish Travel Agents Association, Mr. Pat Dawson, CEO of Irish Travel Agents Association, Mr. Eoghan Cullen, President of Irish Airline Pilots Association, Mr. Alan Bretterton, Vice President, Irish Airline Pilots Association, Ms. Ashley Connolly, Aviation Sector Organiser, FORSA Union, Trade Union, Mr. Johnny Fox, Assistant General Secretary, Service and Enterprise Division, FORSA Trade Union, Mr. Paddy Kavanagh, General Secretary, Connect Trade Union, Mr. Neil McGowan, Aviation Sector Organiser, SIPTA Trade Union, and Mr. Tony Carroll, Industrial Aviation Sector, SIPTA Trade Union. You're welcome, and I would like to particularly thank you all for placing such short notice. A note on privilege: all witnesses are again reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice that you should not criticise and make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her or it identifiable or otherwise engage in speech that might be regarded as damage to the good name of the person or entity. Therefore, for statements are potentially defamatory in relation to an identified person or entity, you be directed to continue your remarks and empowered that you comply with any such direction. For witnesses attending remotely outside the Leinster House campus, there is some limitation to parliamentary privilege, and as such may not benefit from the same level of immunity from legal proceedings as a witness physically present does. Witnesses participating in this committee session from jurisdiction outside the state are advised that they should also be mindful of our domestic law and how it may apply to the evidence they give. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person or entity outside the House or an official either by name or in such a way as to make her identifiable. I also like to remind members that they are only allowed to participate in this meeting if they are physically located in the Leinster House complex. If in this regard, I would also ask members, prior to their making the contribution to this meeting, that you confirm that you are on the grounds Leinster House campus. For anyone watching this meeting online, Oireachtas members and witnesses are assessing this meeting remotely. Only I, as chair, and necessary staff essential to the running of the meeting physically present in the committee room. Due to these unprecedented circumstances and the large number of people attending remotely, everyone to bear with us should technical issues arise. Just to draw attention, we have severe time limitations, which I apologise for, but in COVID, so we're very restricted on time. So I would ask both the witnesses and the members to operate within the time slot. Otherwise, what I want us to get today is the key message you want to give to us and the ask that you have for the people that you represent, and that we go away with a collective view. But I'm very conscious of the lack of time, limitations of time. We'll now move to witnesses. I'd ask Mr. Cullen on behalf of the Irish Pilots Association. You have 4 minutes, Mr. Cullen. I apologise for the time limitation, but we are where we are. Mr. Cullen. Just to make sure you're not on mute, Mr. Cullen.
The Irish Airline Pilots Association welcomes the opportunity to appear before the Oireachtas Transport and Communication Networks Committee on behalf of 1,200 professional pilot members in Ireland. Mindful of the short time available to us today, this opening statement is short and focused on one or two key issues identified by ALPA members as significant for the continued survival of the aviation sector in Ireland. We refer to recent news coverage and reported comments from the Taoiseach in the Irish Times 26th of January that international travel was unlikely to reopen until sometime in the future, certainly not for the summer. It appears that there is now a prevailing narrative that our international travel is preventing Ireland from becoming a COVID-free island like New Zealand. Clearly, the government now shares this view and are preparing to further close Ireland to international travel for the foreseeable future. Regardless of whether an international travel ban will suppress virus transmission in Ireland, we are fully supportive of any measures aimed at protecting public health and reducing the prevalence of this virus. Irish Airlines, however, rely on summer bookings to make enough money to tide them over the loss-making winter season. The loss of a second consecutive summer season, coming after an entire year of practically zero revenue, will prove fatal for airlines that have already depleted their cash reserves. The 80 million support package for the aviation sector announced in November was essentially a grant for Ireland's airports, and the majority of which are state-owned. The funds left over for the airlines may have at least covered a few days' worth of losses. Our airlines are intrinsic to the success of the island nation like Ireland, and their role supplies economic lifeblood bringing amongst other things, FDI and an estimated 10 billion into the Irish economy annually. Every aircraft that leaves Ireland will represent lost jobs and lost GDP. It is an economic fact that if our airlines are allowed to go out of business, the consequences for the Irish economy will be devastating. Most governments have recognised such dangers and have accepted that if they are to intervene to prevent airline operations for the sake of virus suppression, then they must ensure that those airlines do not go out of business as a result. New Zealand, so often the favoured COVID comparator, moved quickly to extend supports worth 900 million Air New Zealand dollars. Much closer to home, the list includes Lufthansa, 10 billion, Air France, 7 billion, BA, 2.5 billion, Air Portugal, TAP is 1.2 billion. The UK government provided a loan of 670 million euro to Ryanair, an Irish airline. Such was the value they placed on their contribution to the UK economy. We have attached recent media coverage detailing state aid approved by the European Commission for dozens of European airlines from their respective governments. Why does Ireland remain an outlier as the only European country to not provide meaningful financial aid to its indigenous airlines? The window remaining for decisive action is fast closing. Airlines plan and budget for their vitally summer schedules at this time of year, and they will soon have to make hard decisions based on expected market conditions. Our government needs to understand that creditors and airline owners will not allow yet another lost summer. They will cut their losses and move their money and assets to other countries that support aviation. The market will not save Ireland's airlines. If international travel must be suppressed into the future, then significant financial aid for Irish airlines is the only option available to avert sectoral collapse. If the government acts to suppress travel, then the government must also act to save our airlines from the destruction that such interventions cause. They cannot have it both ways. We implore you to lobby the government to provide meaningful financial aid to Ireland's airlines before it is too late. And just a note, Chairman, that it was reported in the media over the weekend that Aer Lingus accessed a 150 million loan facility. That, we understand, was to address a problem that they had last year. It will not do anything for the problem that is now being created because the government have cancelled summer of 2021. That ends our submission. In our submission, we also include a document on the importance of air transport, an IATA document to Ireland, and we also provide detailed information of the dozens of airlines across Europe that have received direct government aid. So that's it.
And thank you, Mr. Cullen, for bearing within the time. Appreciate that. We now move to Ms. Connolly on behalf of Forsyth Trade Union. Ms. Connolly, you have 4 minutes. And make sure your mic is... Yeah, proceed.
Chairperson, members of the committee. Forsyth represents over 80,000 members, including around 5,000 workers in airlines, airports, air navigation bases, aviation regulatory bodies and air traffic control. 11 months of pay cuts, layoffs, redundancies and job insecurity and continued uncertainty about the future has put aviation workers and their families under massive strain. For many, the mortgage and other debt incurred during this period of time will be a burden for years to come. It is not sustainable for these members to continue to endure this hardship. While with no early end to travel restrictions in sight, thousands of jobs will remain at risk unless the state acts now. While the industry and its staff have benefited from state wage supports, Ireland continues to lack a European-style joined-up government approach to underpin jobs in the sector, protect aviation infrastructure and ensure the survival of a viable post-pandemic industry. This runs the risk that Irish aviation will be left behind when the rest of the world moves on, with potentially devastating implications for the national economy and employment in the aviation and the sectors and communities that depend upon it. It is highly likely, if not certain, that aviation will be the last among the industries to emerge from this crisis. Yet the government has been slow to engage fully with stakeholders. Recommendations from the Task Force for Aviation and from this committee have been largely ignored. This inaction is placing at risk an entire industry and the jobs and connectivity it supports. Force's written submission to this committee gives a detailed assessment of the impact of the crisis across the industry and contains a range of recommendations, both for the sector as a whole and for Pacific companies. I want to draw particular attention to 3 industry-wide requirements. Firstly, we make recommendations regarding income supports, which acknowledge their contribution to this sector and its staff, while highlighting the need for a flexible industry-specific approach for this phase of the aviation crisis. There is a strong risk that the Employment Wage Subsidy Scheme, as currently constructed, will lack the flexibility required to underpin employment relationships in the sector, and it is essential if we are to position the industry to bounce back post-COVID. Force is proposing an aviation income support scheme similar to that in place in Germany, which enables employers to reduce hours rather than laying staff off, with government income supports for the time employees can't work. Second, we emphasise the need for government-led social dialogue with employers and unions to underpin a sustainable and thriving aviation industry as we emerge from this pandemic. Thirdly, Force is calling for the Central Bank to adopt European Banking Authority guidelines for the extension of mortgage payments breaks in 2021. The European guidelines do not currently apply in Ireland, where the application process is slow and onerous. After 11 months of income reductions and no early sight of recovery, this is placing avoidable strain on air workers. Ireland went into this crisis as a major force in global aviation, and our connectivity to the rest of the world plays a crucial role in supporting economic activity and attracting inward investment. It is therefore crucial that we act collectively. We ensure the industry not only survives the impact of this current crisis, but that it is fit to perform robustly as and when safe international travel resumes. Force's approach has been to work closely with aviation employers to maximise job protections, but this approach cannot succeed without significant and continuing government support and intervention. The union continues to call for any such supports to be contingent on the avoidance of compulsory redundancies and offshoring of Irish aviation jobs. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Ms Connolly. We now move on to Mr Kavanagh on behalf of Connect Trade Union. You have 4 minutes, Mr Kavanagh.
Thank you. I won't take as long because most of the points have been said and I don't repeat them. Look, basically to summarise for us, since we last met in November, the situation for our members has continued to deteriorate and the situation has got much worse. Reports back from our members in the industry. Now, Connect Trade Union will also not only represent members in the airlines and in the airports, but also in production areas. And at the moment, those workers are also experiencing significant layoffs and redundancies, and also an inability for younger workers, particularly, to obtain mortgages, etc., because of the reduced circumstances. So we have even had situations where workers have had agreements deferred for pay, etc. So in the end, when we look at it, also the concerns for health and safety, and particularly roll out vaccines for workers in airports, because if people are to be ready for the upsurge, they have to be protected for when that comes. We all know the downturn in figures. We all know the impact that has had on the numbers. However, we reiterate what has been said earlier about increased government support for the industry, similar to what we have seen across Europe. Because in the end, what we're calling for is a couple of very precise issues that we feel have been kind of missed as part of this. Particularly, no worker should be made compulsory redundant while his employer is benefiting from any government subsidy during the pandemic. Also, the legislation on redundancy, that currently, because of that legislation, workers who are on layoff or reduced hours cannot avail of voluntary redundancy, and yet the legislation bars that service from being counted, that time from being counted as service, and that if we're denying workers the right to obtain redundancy, surely that time should be counted as service. And that is a serious issue to our members. We would support something similar to the German Kaiser-Bietergeld system, or even that of Sweden, where workers who are continuing to work during this pandemic should be supported to greater terms. And in relation to that, we have concerns of a future skills shortage in the area where our members who work in maintenance and specialist roles, because people are leaving, and when the upturn comes, there will be a skills shortage, because these are particular and precise and specialist skills our members would have in these areas. And we are concerned that when the upturn comes, and it will come, that there will be a shortage of skills. So in line with that, we're asking the state to see this as an opportunity to supplement the industry involved for specialist upgrading works or maintenance works that could be done to have the airports and the airlines ready for the upsurge when it comes. And basically everything else that has been said we would support, but we would like to highlight that we understand our union would have a third of its membership in construction. While construction is badly hit, we do understand that that will come back much more rapidly than aviation. Aviation will not be where it was until 2024, according to the latest estimates, or maybe even 2025. So the workers in that sector will suffer the longest hit, and they have to be taken care of with some sort of a scheme to ensure that while they're maintained in the industry, that their earnings will be protected. I will leave it there.
Thanks, Mr. Kavanagh. Now move on to Mr. McGowan. SIPTO, 4 minutes. Mr. McGowan.
Thank you. Chairperson and members of the committee, the COVID pandemic has had a devastating impact on the aviation industry that continues to worsen by the day. All workers in aviation have suffered a significant drop in income due to the pandemic. Those that have remained in work have suffered drops in working hours and pay. Thousands have faced layoff, and many more have lost their jobs on a permanent basis. Flights and passenger numbers have collapsed and the industry has been brought to its knees. The outlook for aviation in the short to medium term is bleak, and workers face into 2021 with real uncertainty and fear for their jobs. Despite the dramatic drop in earnings, workers in aviation continue to work throughout the pandemic. This has allowed the essential supply of medical supplies, PPE, and most recently vaccines into the country. State supports in relation to wage subsidies and financial support, such as those for the regional airports, are welcome, but simply do not go far enough given the depth and breadth of the crisis. To ensure that we have an aviation industry post-COVID, we believe a number of actions need to be taken immediately by government. SIPTO recommends the extension and amendment of the employment wage subsidy scheme for the aviation sector to ensure that employment is maintained in the industry. The scheme should be tailored for the aviation industry so it becomes a genuine short-time working scheme based on the German model that pays 85% of their pre-COVID earnings. It must be made conditional on several binding commitments from the employers, including that no worker is made redundant on a compulsory basis while the employer is benefiting from the EWSS, that no worker suffers a permanent reduction in any term and condition of employment unless by collective agreement while the employer is benefiting from these supports. SIPTO recommends that Shannon Airport be returned to the same management group as Dublin and Cork airports. The separation of Shannon Airport has not been a success, and the COVID crisis has brought into question its long-term viability. Given its absolute importance to the region's economy, we believe it must be brought back into the same management group as the other state airports. SIPTO recommends the introduction of a free and rapid testing facility for all airport workers, and that aviation workers are given the vaccine at the appropriate time. Any financial support by the state directly to airports or airlines, and we do believe that significant financial support is absolutely required, well in addition to what we've seen to date, must be accompanied by a conditionality that prohibits compulsory redundancies or a reduction in terms and conditions. In the absence of the government taking meaningful action, we simply will not have a functioning aviation sector in this country. Given we are an open island economy, the country will not recover to the full extent without a functioning aviation sector. The thousands of people who depend on aviation directly and the hundreds of thousands in the wider economy who need a functioning aviation industry need the government to act now through the tailored supports that our union is calling for. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. McGowan.